Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. We finally have a look at the much anticipated Mercedes sidepod and front suspension upgrades that are arriving here at Monaco. We're going to look at all the comparison shots today between what the sidepods and the front suspension used to look like, what it now looks like, what philosophy they are exploring, because it's not quite a Red Bull concept. It actually falls more in line with Aston Martin, which might make more sense for reasons we shall get into. Very much enjoyed to your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. So Total Wolf says, look, this is not a silver bullet. It's not going to solve everything overnight, but he hopes they can build on this going forward. It's the first step in a new development direction. So these were the first images we got starting to come out yesterday, but there wasn't really so much to even look at in the way that, look, we knew the zero pods were going to go, but an image like this doesn't really show you that much in terms of what the design concept is actually going to be like, and that's where it kind of came in today. This is another angle though, and this is where you can quite clearly see from the front of the sidepod on the left hand side to the rear of the sidepod on the right hand side. The sloping water slide is what people are referring to this as. Now, Aston Martin were the first to kind of introduce this. Alpine have something relatively similar as well, but Aston Martin for Mercedes has probably been the one to look at, because if they try and copy Red Bull, they're never going to catch up to Red Bull. Red Bull have such a good understanding of that car concept. If they just go for a Black Bull, it's never going to work out to be the best car. Aston Martin obviously have something rather good going for them. The fact that they've been able to go from where they were last year to where they are this year is incredibly impressive, with additional Mercedes architecture such as their gearbox, such as their rear suspension, which is limiting Aston Martin more than where they would like to be. So looking at Aston Martin's sidepod design and their front suspension design should be great for Mercedes, because if Aston Martin are 5/10 off Red Bull as a customer team of Mercedes, Mercedes should be way closer theoretically. But there was a few things Aston Martin did well that Mercedes didn't get into. Now, on the surface, these look, relatively simple designed side pods, and in fairness, they kind of are, but it still has some elements, and it's more simple than the zero pod concept in a way, and it's not quite a Red Bull concept. It doesn't quite have that deep undercut on the side pod. What it does have is, it's almost Ferrari-esque in a way, like looking back to last year's Ferrari, that kind of like bowl shape on the top of the side pod, but also it's Aston Martin-esque in terms of that water slide phenomenon where the air just kind of flows down and it has a very steep drop with some undercut as well, like we see on the Red Bull. So this is another, these are all the images that were coming out here, the side-by-sides of what they now look like. And in some ways, it's a shame, right, the zero pod didn't work out, just because it was such an exciting innovation from Mercedes. And, the idea was make the sidepod super narrow, increase the open area that the floor is exposed to, and therefore generate more downforce that way. In theory, super cool idea, and if it worked, it would have been, a crazy innovation for the sport. Didn't work out, and in the end, that philosophy, the ceiling of it wasn't as high as what the Red Bull's been able to achieve, and probably Aston Martin's idea as well. So they're going down a more traditional route, but still, it's not exactly identical to all the other teams on the grids. This is what the opening looks like then at the front of the sidepod. So look, it's more conventional, it's more traditional. That maybe not a massive surprise. And just looking by comparison, right, compared to the old version with the zero pod that really came in super narrow, compared to the new, far more traditional, conventional approach, which is probably more similar to the Alpine and the Aston Martin especially than it is to the Red Bull, which is probably a sensible decision. But you can just compare the analysis on this. This is another angle of it as well, comparing the previous version to what it currently looks like. It's obviously a night and day difference. That requires so many other changes as well. This is the difficulty for these teams. You want to change the side pods, you've got to change all the cooling mechanics within those side pods. It's not cheap, it's not easy to do, and this is one of the reasons why Mercedes can't just spend, $400 million to do everything brand new. They have to be restrictive on what they try and accomplish. This is another head-to-head comparison here between the older, very slim versions with the very tiny opening compared to this version, which is more akin in a way to the Mercedes W13 original concept they brought to Barcelona in terms of the entrance to the side pods, but it is a different concept from there on back, which has been more Aston Martin inspired, I think. This is, again, the opening, what it used to be compared to what it currently is. Big differences, and these all try and work together, right? The changes to the side pods, the changes to the front suspension, the changes to the floor will all intend to get Mercedes to where they want to be, but they probably won't get there immediately, and it's difficult to say how well we might even see this weekend in Monaco. this is just the comparison. This is the water slides that people have noticed on the Aston Martin. It doesn't have as deep of an undercut on the sidepod as the Red Bull does, kind of like what we see now with the new Mercedes, but it does have this very steep water slide phenomenon. So Aston Martin have probably gone the most extreme with this idea, and Aston Martin is kind of a hybrid in a way of the Red Bull and the Ferrari concept, and that seems to be what Mercedes are now exploring. This is, by example, the Red Bull. This is the RB18, the RB19 at the bottom, this very deep undercut on the sidepod to accelerate all the air in this section, and like, they do this better than anybody else. But some teams have different ideas, and if, you know, Mercedes were to come up with an exact replica of this, it probably wouldn't be as effective as Red Bull are able to accomplish. Arguably, though, what's more interesting, the sidepod catches all the attention because it's the biggest thing that you can see, especially when the zero pod is now gone and probably never returning in the history of Formula 1, honestly, who knows. This is the front suspension changes, and this is probably, if anything, more important to the state of the car. Now, from this angle, you can't see much change. What you've got to look at is the comparison between where the wishbones used to be, this is the old version at the top, and where they now are. Now, this angle here, this kind of like triangular shape, is actually very similar to what you see on the Red Bull and the Aston Martin. The Mercedes and the Ferrari started the season with a different concept. We'll see a graphic of that actually here in a second. This is a pretty good one to look at. So if you guys just have a look at the top here on what, so this is, I guess, back in Bahrain, the angle of these wishbones on the front suspension of the Red Bull and the angle of them on the Aston Martin, you can see this kind of triangular shape we just looked at. This is, though, what it looked like by comparison on the Mercedes and the Ferrari, pretty much just a flat line. And also on the other side, it's a pretty similar idea. So this is what Mercedes looked at. Well, like, hang on a second, how are Aston Martin achieving what they're achieving? And it must be in the front suspension, because Aston Martin share the rear suspension and the gearbox of the Mercedes. So I think Mercedes knew that whatever they're doing at the front suspension, especially if it's similar to Red Bull, is probably the way to go. And we can actually see on the new element of the car, like highlighted here in purple, a very similar idea. So there's been a big discussion of the last day or so. Is this an anti-dive suspension geometry? Now, some have said no, some have said yes, because that's the key advantage that Red Bull seem to be getting with their suspension, is this anti-dive idea, where effectively if the car brakes, the nose will drop down on the car just naturally under braking forces, but you can set up the suspension to prevent that from happening, and Red Bull have done so to the maximum possible degree, and therefore they're getting a lot of advantage from that in straight line speed, in DRS efficiency, and mainly in terms of how low they can run their car to the ground, because it barely ever deviates forward and backward, so it's flat all the time and generating maximum downforce. This is a concept that other teams would look at but think, well, there's downsides to it, and there are downsides such as tyre warm-up and therefore qualifying performance, which we do see with Red Bull relative to where they are in race pace, and other teams are seemingly exploring the same thing. And that is, you know, there's been some debate. Are Mercedes actually going for this? Are they not? But the rumour has they probably are, right? And the article describes here how the Aston and the Alpine design is more similar, but it also says that, yeah, like they're changing the lead arm of the upper wishbone such that, you know, the anti-dive behaviour is now more prominent, which is more similar to what, you know, Red Bull are trying to accomplish here. So there's more to come. How this interacts with the floor is another big question that we're never really too sure of. This is another beautiful image here, probably the most high quality one I could see of that new sidepod design and concept. But what it really comes down to is this suspension design, because that seems to be the way that Red Bull are getting such their advantage. And look, in the short term, is it going to make a massive amount of difference? It's tough to say. It's Monaco after all. It's going to be a very difficult circuit to predict how things are going to go. But yeah, rumour says that yes, they've looked into the anti-dive effect. That's what they're trying to accomplish here with this new suspension design. And if anything, that's going to be more influential to any of their success from now to the end of the season than the new sidepod concept is. Mercedes repeatedly said for a long time that the sidepod design was not what was causing their issues, but it turns out that it was at least part of the problem, at least in terms of the ceiling of their potential concept, you know, what their concept can achieve if it got to its maximum level, and Red Bull is still upgrading their version that clearly has a higher ceiling. So very much intrigued to your thoughts and all that in the comment section below. Just to finish up with a couple of interesting things. Firstly here, confirmation yesterday that Aston Martin Honda will be a thing come 2026. This is actually going to be a works arrangement, i.e. Honda will not have another Formula 1 team. They're not going to come in and buy Alfa Tauri and make that their main team. Aston, because obviously that doesn't help Aston Martin, because otherwise, you know, it's a Mercedes V2. They want their own power unit supplier, and that's how it's going to be. Aston Martin Honda will be a thing from 2026. Really big story, actually. Of course, we've heard Alonso talk about this over the last few hours or so in terms of how positive this is for the team. Now, look, he didn't get on with Honda back in the day. Will he still be there in 2026? Mike Crack, their team principal, said there's no reason why they won't have him, but you've got to wonder whether he'll still be around when he's like 44. But also, they've mentioned that Yuki Tsunoda is a tremendously exciting driver and will be considered for the seat. You do have to wonder come 2026. If Aston Martin are really integral, are really bound on getting all the way to a WDC or even the World Constructors' Championship with Honda as their manufacturer, is Lance Stroll good enough in that situation, right? Is Alonso still there? That's another debate entirely, but is Lance Stroll going to be the second driver at that point? It's a good question. It's an interesting one because Martin Whitmarsh says we're here to win as a Honda. So in 2026, we have to start winning together. We have to have great drivers. Now, you know, Lance Stroll, I think, is a good driver, but he's not a great driver. Maybe he can become that over the coming years. But definitely some interesting questions there that have been going around. Also, Fred Vasseur says that absolutely didn't happen, that he gave Lewis Hamilton a contract offer, or the team has given Hamilton a contract offer. So some more denials of that story. And he also said, look, 3 weeks ago, you said Sainz was going to Audi. 2 weeks ago, he said Charles was going to Mercedes, so the rumour mill keeps on spinning. But very much enjoyed to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.